Rain slicked the pavement as the faint glow of streetlights mingled with the flashing red and blue of a police cruiser. The quiet hum of the city at night was broken only by the sound of Officer Daniel Carter's boots splashing through shallow puddles. His face was expressionless, professional, as he approached the sleek black sedan parked just inches over the no parking line. The drizzle had turned heavier, the water beating off his uniform as he pulled out his notepad. It was a routine stop, one of countless encounters he had each week. A small infraction, a simple ticket, nothing unusual, at least, that's what he thought. Standing by the car, a black woman in her early 40s waited calmly, her tailored blazer clinging to her shoulders in the damp night air. Her umbrella shielded her from the rain, but it did nothing to mask her composed defiance. In her hand, she held her license and registration, extended with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced this moment far too often. Elaine Harper's expression was polite, yet unyielding, her dark eyes locking with Daniel's as he stepped closer. What if this was it? Elaine thought. What if this was the moment it all went wrong? To Daniel, she was just another name, another ticket, another box to check before his shift ended. But to Elaine, this was an all-known familiar scene, a quiet reminder of the system she had spent her entire life navigating and resisting. A crowd began to gather, their murmurs blending with the rain, thick and unspoken. What neither of them knew at that moment was how this single encounter would unravel decades of assumptions, challenge the foundations of power, and force a reckoning neither could have anticipated. Elaine Harper was a figure of quiet strength and purpose, a woman whose life had been defined not by what was handed to her, but by what she fought for. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood on the edge of the city, she had grown up in a world of tight-knit communities bound by resilience. Her childhood had been shaped by the harsh realities of systemic inequality, overcrowded classrooms, underfunded schools, and neighborhoods plagued by neglect. But even as a child, Elaine was different. She was the one who carried a book wherever she went, her curious eyes scanning pages long after the streetlights came on. Elaine had a gift, a sharp mind, and a steadfast heart that refused to accept mediocrity. Teachers who recognized her potential encouraged her, often marveling at her discipline and empathy. It was no surprise when she graduated top of her high school class and went on to earn a scholarship to a prestigious university. But unlike many who left for better opportunities and never returned, Elaine came back. She knew her calling was in the community that had raised her. Becoming a teacher wasn't just a career for Elaine, it was a mission. Her classroom was a sanctuary. The walls were lined with bookshelves crammed with literature and history, vibrant posters of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Maya Angelou, reminding her students of the giants whose shoulders they stood on. Her lessons weren't limited to textbooks. She taught her students how to navigate a world that didn't always see their worth. Firm but compassionate, she was the kind of teacher who stayed after school to tutor struggling kids and used her own money to buy supplies when budgets fell short. The neighborhood around her reflected her struggles and triumphs. It was a place of vibrant life, with children playing in narrow streets and elders gathering on stoops to swap stories. But it was also a place of visible decay. Graffiti-covered walls, broken streetlights, and boarded-up shops told of years of neglect. Elaine's car, parked near her favorite coffee shop that evening, was a symbol of her life, practical yet dignified, a quiet statement of perseverance. The stage was set for what would unfold, a seemingly ordinary night and an extraordinary life. Elaine Harper, with her unshakable resolve and unassuming grace, was about to face a challenge that would test not only her patience, but her belief in the justice she had long taught her students to pursue. The night had begun like so many others. Elaine Harper had wrapped up a long day at school and stopped at her favorite cafe to grab a cup of tea. She parked her car in a spot she had used countless times before, just outside the cafe on a quiet street with faded parking lines. Inside, she exchanged pleasantries with the barista, a former student, and lingered for a moment to chat with a few community members about the upcoming school fundraiser. It was a small but cherished routine, a moment of respite in her otherwise demanding schedule. When Elaine stepped back outside, tea in hand, she noticed the flashing lights of a patrol car behind her vehicle. A white police officer stood by her car, pen in hand, scribbling onto a note. Her first reaction was confusion. She hadn't parked illegally, had she? She approached calmly, her heels clicking on the wet pavement, and greeted the officer politely. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. Officer Daniel Carter barely glanced at her before responding. "Your car is over the line, ma'am. I'm issuing a citation for improper parking." Elaine looked at the spot, her brows furrowing. Yes, the front of her car was slightly over the line, but only because the curb paint was faded and the street was uneven. "I understand," she replied, "but this seems like a minor mistake. Couldn't a warning suffice?" Daniel's tone was curt. "Rules are rules, ma'am." Elaine sighed but handed over her license and registration as requested. It was a small irritation, but she could handle it. However, when Daniel returned, his expression had shifted to something more officious, more rigid. "Your registration is flagged as expired," he said, holding up the document. Elaine frowned. "That's not possible. I renewed it last month. There must be a mistake in the system. Regardless, I'm going to have to issue another citation," he said, his voice firm, "and I'll need you to step out of the vehicle." The request caught her off guard. "Step out of the vehicle? For what reason?" "Ma'am, your registration is invalid. I need to verify there's nothing else going on here." The absurdity of the situation began to dawn on Elaine. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. This wasn't just about a minor infraction, it was about her identity, her presence in this space, and how she was being perceived. As she complied, stepping out of her car into the cold rain, a small crowd began to gather. People from the neighborhood, curious and wary, stood at a distance, their murmurs carrying in the air. Elaine's composure remained intact, but inside, she felt a growing frustration. She knew how quickly situations like this could escalate, and she was determined not to give Daniel any reason to escalate further. "I'm a teacher at Franklin Elementary," she explained, keeping her voice steady. "I'm sure this is just a clerical error. If you give me a moment, I can pull up the renewal receipt on my phone." But Daniel seemed unmoved. "You can take that up with the DMV. I need to follow procedure." And then came the handcuffs. The cold metal encircled her wrists, a sharp contrast to her warm professionalism. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some voices rising in disbelief. "She's Miss Harper," someone shouted. "She's one of the good ones." Elaine felt the sting of humiliation, but forced herself to remain calm. "Officer Carter, this isn't necessary," she said evenly. "You're making a mistake." Daniel hesitated for the briefest moment, but his training and biases held firm. He led her to the back of the cruiser, ignoring the growing tension from the onlookers. At the station, Elaine's frustration turned to a quiet rage as she sat in the holding area, the sterile fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. She was treated with polite indifference by the officers processing her. Despite her calm demeanor and her repeated explanations about the registration error, it was clear that her voice carried little weight in this environment. Daniel, meanwhile, couldn't shake the nagging sense that something about this wasn't right. Back at his desk, he reviewed her file and saw her full name, Elaine Harper. The name tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. Then, as he stared at her photo, it hit him like a bolt of lightning. Miss Harper, 6th grade, the teacher who had pulled him aside when he was on the brink of expulsion, who had spent hours after school tutoring him in history and encouraging him to believe he could be better than his circumstances. She had been his hero, the one person who had seen potential in him when no one else did. A flood of emotions surged through Daniel. Guilt, shame, disbelief. He had arrested the woman who had shaped his life, the woman he owed so much to. He rushed back to the holding area, his face pale. Elaine was sitting on the bench, her posture still dignified despite the circumstances. "Miss Harper," he began, his voice faltering. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Daniel Harder," she said slowly, recognition dawning on her face. "You're the boy who used to sit in the back row, always doodling in your notebook?" The weight of the moment hung heavy between them. I didn't realize, he started, but Elaine cut him off. You didn't realize I was human, or that I deserved better than this? Her voice was calm, but her words cut deep. Daniel stammered, searching for the right thing to say. But how do you apologize for such a betrayal? Before he could respond, the station's captain entered, drawn by the growing commotion. Elaine didn't miss a beat. Captain, I want to file a formal complaint. This is not just about me. It's about how many others have been treated like this, without a voice, without recourse. The captain glanced at Daniel, then back at Elaine. Ms. Harper, we'll look into the matter, he said, his tone dismissive. But Elaine wasn't done. Looking into it isn't enough. This department needs to face the biases embedded in its procedures, and I'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. The tension in the room was palpable. Daniel knew she was right. He also knew this moment would force him to confront the blind spots he'd carried for so long. As the night wore on, Elaine's determination only grew, and Daniel, for the first time, began to see the cracks in the system he had sworn to uphold. It wasn't just about her. It was about all the others like her, who had been silenced, humiliated, or overlooked. What had started as a minor infraction was now a reckoning. Elaine Harper was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for justice, and Daniel Carter was about to learn that redemption was a path paved with accountability. The conference room at the precinct was tense, its walls lined with whiteboards covered in procedural notes and policy reminders. Elaine Harper sat at the long table's center, her back straight and her expression unreadable. Across from her sat Captain Reynolds, a grizzled veteran of the force with a reputation for being immovable. Officer Daniel Carter stood off to the side, his face pale and drawn, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Around the room, other officers and legal representatives watched, in a mix of curiosity and unease. Elaine began, her voice steady but firm. I wanted on record that my arrest was unwarranted and humiliating. I complied with every request, yet I was treated as though I posed a threat. Why? Because my car was over a faded line? Captain Reynolds leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Ms. Harper, this department has procedures. Officer Carter was following them. If your registration was flagged, that's a legitimate cause for further investigation. Elaine's gaze didn't waver. And the handcuffs? Was that necessary? Was I behaving in a way that warranted such treatment, or was it easier to assume I might? Let's not pretend this is just about protocol, Captain. This is about perception. And in this city, perception too often correlates with skin color. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Daniel's face tightened, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. Reynolds shifted, his tone becoming defensive. We can't afford to make exceptions. We deal with situations based on the information we have at the moment. And that's precisely the problem, Elaine countered. Her voice rose slightly, not in anger but in conviction. The information you have at the moment is colored by biases that go unchecked. When you saw me, a black woman, in a nice car, you didn't see a professional, an educator, someone who contributes to this community. You saw someone you had to control. Daniel stepped forward, his voice trembling. Miss Harper, Elaine, I made a mistake. I didn't see you for who you are. Elaine turned to him, her expression softening just slightly. No, Daniel, you didn't see me at all. And that's the problem. How many others like me have you not seen? The silence in the room was deafening. Then Elaine continued, addressing everyone. This isn't just about me or Officer Carter. This is about a system that allows good people to make bad decisions because it doesn't require them to examine their assumptions. It's about a culture that prioritizes authority over understanding. And I won't let this go. Not this time. Reynolds sat forward, his voice hard. What exactly are you suggesting, Ms. Harper? That we overhaul the entire department because of one parking violation? Elaine leaned forward, meeting his stare. I'm suggesting you start by acknowledging the problem, by holding officers accountable, by implementing mandatory bias training, and involving the community in oversight. Because if you don't, this won't just be about me. It'll be about every headline, every lawsuit, every life damaged by your refusal to change. At that moment, a knock at the door interrupted the charged silence. A young officer entered, looking flustered. "Captain, there's a crowd gathering outside. They're here for Ms. Harper." Elaine looked toward the door, surprised. She hadn't asked anyone to come, but it didn't surprise her that her community had shown up. The group moved to the precinct's front windows. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Parents, students, colleagues, and neighbors. Some held signs, "Justice for Ms. Harper," "Educators deserve respect." Others simply stood in solidarity, their presence a powerful statement. Reynolds muttered under his breath, his annoyance palpable. "This isn't helping." Elaine turned to him. "Isn't it? That's the community you're supposed to serve. Those are the voices you're supposed to protect, not silence." Daniel stepped forward again, his voice stronger now. "Captain, she's right. What happened wasn't just about protocol. It was about my failure to question the way I see things. I arrested my own teacher, the woman who believed in me when no one else did. And now I see how blind I've been." Elaine regarded him for a long moment. "The first step to change is admitting there's a problem. The next step is doing something about it." Reynolds sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Fine, we'll review the incident and consider additional training measures. But don't think this means sweeping reform." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "Captain, this isn't a negotiation. This is a demand. And if you're not willing to take this seriously, there are plenty of people out there," she gestured toward the crowd, "who will make sure you do." The tension in the room reached its peak, then broke as the captain stood. "We'll talk with the community leaders. This isn't over." "No," Elaine said firmly. "It's not." The meeting ended, but the weight of what had transpired lingered. Outside, as Elaine stepped into the night, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. She smiled, finally allowing herself a moment to feel the strength of the support around her. Daniel followed her out, stopping her as she reached her car. "Miss Harper," he said quietly, "I can't undo what I did, but I want to do better. Can you help me?" Elaine looked at him, her face softening once more. "That's up to you, Daniel. But the fact that you're asking is a good start." The night had begun with a parking ticket and an arrest. It ended with a confrontation that shook the foundations of a system, leaving cracks that, one day, might let the light in. The following morning, the story of Elaine Harper's arrest had spread far beyond the precinct and her neighbor. Local news stations ran the footage of the crowd gathered outside the police station, their signs and chants a powerful symbol of solidarity. Social media amplified the incident, with hashtags like "Justice for Elaine" and "Change the System" trending within hours. Elaine's calm yet uncompromising stand against her treatment resonated deeply, sparking discussions not just about her experience, but about the broader implications of systemic bias in law enforcement. At the precinct, Captain Reynolds called an emergency meeting with his leadership team. The outcry had forced his hand, and while he was reluctant, the pressure from both the community and city officials left no room for complacency. The department announced an immediate review of their procedures and commitment to mandatory bias and de-escalation training for all officers. A community advisory board, which had been a long-standing demand from activists, was finally approved, giving residents a voice in police accountability. For Elaine, the resolution came with mixed emotions. She appreciated the support and the steps toward change, but she also understood that the journey was far from over. Standing before the students and teachers at her school assembly that Friday, she addressed the situation with her characteristic grace and honesty. "Some of you have seen the news," she began, her voice steady yet warm. "You've seen what happened. And I want you to know something important. Standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's necessary. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure that no one is treated unfairly because of who they are or what they look like." The gym erupted into applause, with students cheering for the teacher they already adored. Many of them had seen firsthand the power of her words and actions, inspiring them to believe they could be agents of change too. At the precinct, Daniel Carter was grappling with his own transformation. That week, he had requested a transfer to community outreach, a role he once dismissed as unnecessary but now saw as essential. His conversations with Elaine and the ripple effects of her courage had forced him to reevaluate his place in the system. He began attending the community advisory board meetings, listening to the stories of those who had been impacted by biased policing, and committing himself to doing better. The broader implications of Elaine's actions began to manifest in unexpected ways. Other educators and community leaders across the city started speaking out about their own experiences, creating a groundswell of voices demanding more transparency and equity in law enforcement. Policymakers took notice, and soon, conversations about reforming police practices extended to other cities, inspired by the wave of change that had started with Elaine's refusal to be silenced. For Elaine, the journey was deeply personal. That night at the precinct had forced her to revisit memories of other injustices she had quietly endured, moments where she had chosen silence over confrontation. But this she had found her voice, not just for herself, but for her students, her community, and for those who couldn't speak out. Elaine's newfound resolve became a defining aspect of her life. She started holding workshops at her school about civic engagement and standing up against injustice. Parents and students alike saw her not only as a teacher, but as a beacon of strength and fairness. Her name became synonymous with resilience and integrity, a testament to what one person could achieve when they refused to accept the status quo. Months later, as she sat in her classroom preparing for another day, Elaine looked out the window at a mural that had been painted on the side of the school. It depicted a tree, its roots deep and strong, with branches stretching toward the sky. Beneath it was a quote: "Justice is not achieved by waiting for change. It begins when we stand and demand it." Elaine smiled, feeling the weight of the past months settle into something lighter, something hopeful. She had not set out to be a symbol, but she had become one, a reminder that change was possible, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The work was far from over, but she knew now that she had the strength to continue, and that she was not alone. The ripples of her stand continued to spread, touching lives far beyond what she could see, and in that moment, surrounded by the quiet promise of a new day, Elaine Harper knew that this was just the beginning. As the story of Elaine Harper's stand against injustice concludes, we're left with a profound question. How often do we allow systems to define what's acceptable, even when our hearts tell us otherwise? Elaine's courage reminds us that change doesn't happen by accident. It begins with individuals who dare to demand better. Her journey highlights the power of standing up, speaking out, and holding those in authority accountable for their actions. Her story isn't just hers, it's ours too. Every day, people encounter challenges shaped by bias, inequality, or silence in the face of wrongdoing. Perhaps you've experienced it yourself, a moment where you felt unseen, unfairly judged, or silenced. Or maybe you've witnessed someone else's struggle and wondered how to help. The truth is, each of us has a role to play in building a more just and equitable world. So, let's ask ourselves, what would we do in Elaine's shoes? Would we have the strength to speak truth to power? And what small steps can we take today to challenge the systems that perpetuate injustice? If Elaine's story moved you, let it be a catalyst for reflection and action. Take time to listen to the experiences of others, especially those whose voices are often marginalized. Challenge your own assumptions and encourage those around you to do the same. Support organizations and initiatives working toward equity and reform, whether in education, law enforcement, or other areas of society. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand up for what was right? How did it change you? Or what did you learn? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your experiences can inspire others to take their own stand. Elaine Harper's story is a testament to the ripple effect of courage. Change begins when we recognize injustice and refuse to accept it. Together, we can challenge the systems that divide us and build a future rooted in understanding, fairness, and hope. Let this be a call to action, not just to reflect, but to act, and to remember that even the smallest stand can make the biggest difference.